Secretary Schriver, welcome to Taiwan Talks.
Thank you very much.
China's Foreign Minister and leader Xi Jinping have both spoken about U.S. containment, encirclement, suppression, and also a distorted view of China. And Qinggang has warned that if the U.S. doesn't change course, then this could end in conflict and confrontation. So is China a victim here?
Well, we should be working hard to avoid conflict. It would be extraordinarily costly for all parties involved and those on the periphery. So it's unfortunate that he's describing the current state of affairs and the trajectory, one that could lead toward conflict. But look, I've worked in and out of administrations for about 30 years, and we more often than not have leaned forward with engagement. We've more often than not leaned forward in trying to bring China into the international and regional fora. We've tried to be supporters of China's success economically, look at the levels that we trade with them, look at the trade deficits that we bear, look at the amount of Chinese students who train in our institutions of higher learning, particularly in science and engineering. This is hardly a recipe for containment. The fact of the matter is, more recently, China's behavior has become more assertive, and they have been behaving in ways that are a threat to the free and open order in the region, and we have to respond to that. And by the way, it's not just the United States, it's the United States and other countries, which is why they may have this feeling of encirclement, but it's really a reflection that their own behavior is really driving countries to do things to try to promote the free and open order in this environment.
Do you see those comments as almost, could they be seen as a false flag narrative, sort of, the US has pushed us into this, because they are the ones that are talking about conflict?
Yeah, I don't know what's motivating these particular comments. They do tend to blame the United States for a lot of problems in the world, including those outside of China. In fact, they blame us for the war in Ukraine, for pushing NATO expansion and threatening Russia's core security interests. So it's not uncommon for us to hear them trying to cast blame on us and trying to play the role of victim. But I think if you look around the region, again, it's not just the United States. We see pretty strong response throughout the region to China's behavior, which to me suggests more objectively they're a big part of the issue right now, their behavior.
Some of the comments that Gang has made in relation to the US and the Ukraine war, he has said that the US is practicing double standards in defending the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine, but not China's claim over Taiwan, and also arming Taiwan, but accusing China of considering arming Russia. Are these comparable?
No, they're false equivalencies. Ukraine is a sovereign country. President Tsai has said Taiwan is already a sovereign and independent country under the ROC Constitution, so Beijing has an alternate view on that, but we have every right to partner with Taiwan, provide Taiwan security assistance given the threats that Taiwan faces. And really, I think, which parties are the aggressor in each case? Russia's the clear aggressor, unprovoked, tragic invasion. China is the aggressive party in the cross-strait environment. We see it almost on a daily basis with military intimidation and coercion. So there's another area where this is just a false equivalency. We need to deal with the aggressor, the one that's willing to upset the status quo, the one that's willing to risk military conflict through the activities, not the peaceful democratic people that have been victimized.
Does the US see Taiwan as a nation?
We certainly treat Taiwan as a normal nation in a lot of ways. Of course, we have a diplomatic position that we take as a result of our One China policy, so we don't have a formal diplomatic relationship. But the nature of our trade, the nature of our security assistance, to an untrained eye, it looks an awful lot like treating it like a nation, yes.
Because I understand that, in fact, the US position was that this is actually an unresolved issue, Taiwan's sovereignty.
Well, going back to the communiques and what formed our One China policy, we never took a position on the ultimate outcome of the dispute between the two sides, but we acknowledged the position on the two sides that Taiwan was a part of China. By the way, the Chinese also made commitments in those agreements, which ultimately led to us adopting a one China policy, to include taking a fundamentally peaceful approach. I don't see that they're doing that right now, so I don't see that we're necessarily bound by everything that we said in those agreements. But I think our position will remain consistent. We've heard from the Biden administration that they won't alter the one China policy. So that's where we are.
And the justification for arming Taiwan?
Well, the threats that they face, and we have a law in the United States, the Taiwan Relations Act, which obliges us to do it. It's not a policy choice we make, it's actually a legal obligation. But beyond that, it's our interests. Taiwan's our eighth largest trading partner in the world, our sixth largest destination for agricultural products. It's a country that shares our values and promotes those values in the international community. While China is backing Russia in this conflict with Ukraine, Taiwan has been a generous contributor to supporting Ukrainian refugees in Poland, for example. I mean, those two case studies side by side to me suggest Taiwan is worth supporting and worth defending what people have worked so hard here to build.
And why would China provide lethal aid to Russia? Is this to increase their bargaining power when it comes to negotiations?
When Xi Jinping and President Putin declared that their relationship was a strategic one with no limits, Xi Jinping was really making a decision that he'd have to live with almost in perpetuity, that he's in bed with Putin, that this is his most important strategic relationship. And the only thing worse than war in Ukraine for China is Putin losing the war in Ukraine. Then he has no strategic backers, no strategic partners in the world. So I think at a strategic level, they can't see Putin fail. And so while there are certainly downsides to those decisions, and I think our Secretary of State with Wang Yi in Munich was very clear that there should not be lethal aid to Russia, it's a decision that we understand that they're contemplating, and it would be a mistake.
And you're a commissioner on the U.S. China Economic and Security Review. So this sort of work would be exactly the sort of advice that you're giving to Congress. Is that true?
That is true. So we've looked at the war in Ukraine and the implications for China, for the region, and have already included some of those thoughts in our last annual report. But the strategic environment and Xi Jinping's choice to back Putin, I think, will have lasting effect, and it's something we continue to look at. One of the recommendations from our annual report last year was we should look at how to build out potential cost imposition modalities before China makes a disastrous move on Taiwan or something along those lines, for the purpose of having deterrent effect.
And this was also discussed in the initial Taiwan Policy Act.
Yes. Yeah, it's important because deterrence is a psychological effect, and if it's not displayed and not credible, then you might miss the opportunity to have that impact. We know the Chinese are looking at the response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and we see some things in Chinese writings that indicate, well, we're a bigger economy, we're the second largest economy in the world, we have a more diverse economy. Russia's kind of a one-trick pony with oil. Taiwan doesn't have diplomatic relations, whereas Ukraine was a recognized country embraced by the United Nations. So we need to persuade them that despite all that, the cost would be significant and frankly not worth it for China to take drastic action related to Taiwan.
And part of that deterrence that you spoke about is obviously Taiwan arming itself. This is also a deterrence. Now, Mike Gallagher of the U.S. House Committee on China, he visited Taiwan, and then returning back, he talked about, the priority is to arm Taiwan to the teeth. But there is a $19 billion arms backlog. It includes things like harpoons and F-16s. Is there a danger that Taiwan could become a new Ukraine, in that the US would only arm Taiwan significantly with the weapons that it actually needs after an invasion?
Well, Congressman Gallagher is a serious person, and I take what he says very seriously, particularly given that he was here and had a chance to investigate things firsthand. I think our track record of supporting Taiwan's defense needs historically is very good. I think we We're not prepared for the demand surge given the conflict in Ukraine, and this has created some of the backlog. I think we need to work on that and certainly diminish the backlog and the things that Taiwan is waiting for. But we also need to be forward-looking and think about the kinds of things that Taiwan needs for the current environment, for counter-coercion.
What sort of things do you mean?
Well, the form of coercion that we see visibly would be flights across the center line, ships across the center line, bombers circumventing the whole island of Taiwan. So those need to be met consistently, maybe not plane for plane, ship for ship, because Taiwan is a smaller military and is resource constrained. But we can't only think about an invasion scenario and only arm for that and not allow coercion to be met in some fashion. Because ironically, not addressing coercion would make the invasion more likely, not less likely, because the Chinese PLA, CCP tends to push to a point until they meet resistance. If they don't meet resistance, they keep going. And so the coercion will only increase if it's not met with some response.
You know, talking about the coercion, or some people might call it grey zone tactics, what do you think about the limit or the encouragement of the current administration on Taiwan to buy only asymmetric weapons? These are weapons that essentially work once the PLA actually reaches or is not very far from Taiwan's shores. What's your opinion about that?
Well, again, Taiwan faces coercion every day. President Tsai refers to it as cognitive warfare. I think that has to be addressed. And so while I understand the administration wants to prioritize certain capabilities given the urgency of the threat and the possibility of an invasion, I don't think we can only focus on that scenario, nor is that helpful to Taiwan. There are resource constraints and there are trade-offs. Decisions have to be made, and prioritization is wise in a resource-constrained environment. But I think the peacetime or the gray zone coercion scenarios also have to be addressed. And so I hope that the administration will support that as well.
Mm-hmm. Do you see that there's a shift underway in the administration's approach to China's information war? We've had the publicity over this special channel between Taiwan and Washington, and also Michael Chase's visit to Taiwan, as well as the U.S. Taiwan joint troop training, with both in the U.S. and in Taiwan.
Well, I think one of Beijing's goals is to isolate Taiwan, to make Taiwan feel as though they are alone and have no alternative other than to capitulate politically. I think for a long time the concern was being too public about these kinds of exchanges might make the situation worse, anger Beijing, provoke them. I think what we've seen is they're acting more aggressively without these excuses and without these so-called provocations, although they did massively overreact to Speaker Pelosi's visit here. So I think the idea is we need to be a little more public on some of this so that Taiwan and the people don't feel so isolated. They understand that there are things happening government to government levels, military to military levels, that we're thinking through these challenges and we'll be there as a supporter of Taiwan.
And in light of this, should President Tsai Ing-wen meet with Speaker Kevin McCarthy in California rather than in Taiwan?
Well, I'll leave it up to President Tsai and Speaker McCarthy to figure that out. It does make sense to me if she's transiting the U.S. West Coast next month to visit, I believe it's Guatemala, that a stop in California would be a very traditional stop for a transit. And Speaker McCarthy, what member of Congress wouldn't like to have a foreign dignitary visit his district and you know, make a display for the people of California to see what a leadership role he's playing in foreign policy. So I think it's, you know, anytime our leadership can talk to Taiwan's leaders, it's a good thing because we do have so much constraint built into the informal, non-diplomatic relationship. So I encourage it in California, I encourage it in Taiwan, whatever they can work out.
But into the calculus, Tsai won't be received as the president of Taiwan.
Well, we don't have a formal diplomatic relationship. Members of Congress do feel less bound by some of those diplomatic formalities, and I would venture a guess that Speaker McCarthy will call her President Tsai when they meet.
In your opinion, with your years in the Department of Defense, what do you believe will be China's steps if it was to take Taiwan by force?
Well, we're seeing a lot of coercive activities, and some would suggest that this is a way to not only put political pressure on Taiwan, but to start to test Taiwan's defense, their responses, how they deal with flight intercepts and the like. So I think there's probably some truth to that, that they're pushing to a point where they get some resistance, and they're evaluating the will of Taiwan to really respond and defend. I think they've developed certain capabilities that we would expect if there were to be more aggressive action, like cyber capabilities. I think they would try to disrupt a lot of what's happening in Taiwan, the economy, sort of regular routine life through cyber effect if they can. I think the reality is that for China to take Taiwan and really exercise sovereign control, they've got to have boots on the ground. They've got to have people who come in, hold and occupy land and really enforce their will over an otherwise unwilling population. So at the end of the day, it's going to require some amount of lift to get probably hundreds of thousands of people across the Taiwan Strait. And that's really been the long pole in the tent for them for a long time. I'm not sure they're capable of doing that at this juncture. You might have seen our CIA director, William Burns, said he doesn't think Xi Jinping has the confidence that he can do this. I think that's probably right. It's a difficult task. And Taiwan, if you look at just the basic geography, 80 nautical miles of water, mountainous, inhospitable terrain, unfavorable sea conditions for much of the year, very few ports for embarkation that are favorable. This is a pretty hard target, and this would be for a military that hasn't seen combat since 1979. So this is not an easy thing, and I think it should give Xi Jinping pause that they need to be really well sure that they're trained and equipped to do it if they make the decision to go. And I think our job is to make them get up every morning and say, not today, not next week, not next month.
What weapons would Taiwan need to stop or to lessen the impact, the missiles? We have Patriot systems. Do we have enough? Does Taiwan have enough? There's the calls from one side of the debate saying that Taiwan should have the E-2D planes, which is it can scan, it's got the radar 360 degrees, and it's also command and control system. So why is it that the Biden administration, in your view, has stopped the sale of something that could detect and could help in this scenario?
Well, it's hard for me to explain a position I don't necessarily agree with. I think they might have the view that things that are dependent on airfields are more vulnerable during the actual shooting war. And you mentioned missiles being used and the potential for airfields to be taken out. That would lessen the ability to operate a system like the E-2D, obviously. But certainly in peacetime and coercion scenarios, and by the way, interoperability with the United States and Japan, it would be an extremely useful platform. The things I was mentioning earlier about how you have a corridor available to run a blockade, E-2D again would be very favorable for that. But look, you also mentioned Mike Gallagher earlier. I heard Mike Gallagher say not too long ago, look, this isn't complicated. It's not necessarily easy, but it's not complicated. We need to be able to sink a lot of ships. And when you look at that equation, how you get people across the Taiwan Strait, it can't be done really through airlift. It's just, you can't scale quickly enough to get enough people across the strait. It has to be ships. And so the anti-ship coastal missile systems are very effective. I think and that's a combination of what Taiwan produces indigenously and what it's purchasing from the U.S. But I think a lot more underwater, including underwater unmanned, could be very helpful. I think a lot of unmanned aerial could be very helpful. Taiwan is acquiring MQ-9s, which would be helpful for maritime domain awareness, potentially arm those for a more lethal system. But I think even more unmanned, because those are cost effective and cheaper to invest in, but in many ways as lethal as manned platforms. I think those are the kinds of things that could really cause military planners in Beijing to think twice.
So in Taiwan's position, given that it believes that there's a need for, say, like the E-2D plane, and it can't get that from the US, do you think Taiwan should go to other countries, perhaps Israel, some of the European countries, or would it be constrained by the US again?
Well, I think it's understandable that Taiwan would look for other parties to be able to support capabilities that they've identified as requirements. I think the reality is the U.S. has been the only reliable supplier of military equipment for decades now. If Taiwan were to be able to find other countries to support its military needs, I as an American wouldn't oppose it. I don't know what the Biden administration would feel about it.
So we're calling it arms depot, isn't it? So basically locating an Asian, yeah, okay. So in the Taiwanese press, there's been discussions about the depot for storing U.S. arms, a sort of stockpile, and obviously these conversations have been going on, since the Taiwan Policy Act and even before that. What sort of practical benefits would that bring in any invasion?
Well, it would allow the United States and Taiwan to engage in the fight for a greater sustained period than otherwise would be the case because of the tyranny of time and distance. One of the things that will be very challenging for the U.S. in any scenario is to continue to resupply and arm and maintain our military in a contested environment. If a portion of that is forward deployed and safe and secure before the fight begins, that'll give you some breathing space and some time to be able to sustain the fight without being cut off for fear of being cut off. It also, I think, is not isolated to Taiwan. We're looking at this all over the region. We're looking at arrangements in the Philippines. We just announced 4 new military sites through what's called ECTA in the Philippines. We're looking at it in places like the Pacific Islands. Again, for the U.S., this is a problem of time and distance, and so in a contested environment, we're going to want as much of this forward deployed as possible, including in Taiwan.
Does that mean that there might be boots on the ground for U.S. troops?
Well, I don't want to predict a particular scenario and how it would unfold, but I think for Beijing to think about how easily they could take Taiwan, they better think about that as a possibility.